Great. Thank you all for joining our first panel in our Grazing the Wild series, where we talk about facts and fiction about grass-fed beef and cattle grazing. Cattle grazing is a controversial topic, as many of you know. We have a huge turnout for this event. Impacts include habitat loss, deforestation, climate emissions, pollution, and wildlife extinction. Potential solutions look to technology and economic incentives for improvements. And some grazers are looking to carbon sequestration, soil health, and regenerative grazing systems and technologies to address emissions. Grass-fed beef is viewed by them as an answer to the problem of factory farms. But how do we ensure that conversations about soil health and carbon sequestration don't lose the holistic view of how cattle interact with wildlife and wild places to begin with? What does it mean for cattle producers to be, quote unquote, stewards of the land? And how does that change when we focus on biodiversity or include it in the conversation instead of sort of exclusively on soil carbon, for example? People in the United States consume 4 times the global average in beef, and this shapes the way that we talk about and study how we produce beef and how much. The beef industry is embracing this regenerative language in the regenerative agriculture movement. Yet whether it actually makes the industry sustainable is hotly debated. Although it's clear reducing consumption of beef has to be part of that project. So let's learn more with our great panel today. The chat for attendees will be disabled, but at the end, we're going to share a lot of links to the work of the participants and to a community forum where you can join the conversation then. And save your questions until the end. Please post them in the Q&A function and we will get to them and sort of direct them to the panel. But to begin with, let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Tara Garnett is the author of the 2017 report, Grazed and Confused. She's a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and she's the acting director of TABLE, which analyzes evidence that drives perspectives of food systems, controversies, and how knowledge is communicated to policymakers, industry, and stakeholders to build solutions. We're also joined by Nicholas Carter, who's an ecologist and co-founder of plantbaseddata.org. He's an advisor to food and environmental organizations. He leads work at a data hub for the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. He's postgraduate research focused on global greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture. And then we're joined by Chris Bugby, my colleague, who's an interdisciplinary field ecologist, wildlife conservationist, and Southwest advocate at the Center for Biological Diversity. His work focuses on borderland wildlife issues, many of which intersect with cattle grazing. Chris works with me at the center, where I'm the senior food campaigner in the Population and Sustainability Program. So welcome, thank you for being here. The first question we're going to start out with goes to Tara, and it's really sort of, what's the broad state of myths and misunderstandings in terms of grass-fed grazing? You wrote this report about the impacts of cattle production called Grazed and Confused, which is a phenomenal report. Everybody looks to it. Can you give a bit of an overview of some of the misunderstandings, the myths and perceptions about grass-fed beef?
Sure, and thanks very much for having me. So I should say that when it comes to the Grazed and Confused report, we were aware right at the outset that there's a whole range of different issues that you need to consider to gain a kind of 360-degree perspective on the question of grazing livestock, which encompasses things like biodiversity that we're going to be discussing, animal health and welfare, livelihoods, water, and so on and so forth. But we decided to focus on one specific issue, which was the role of grazing animals in contributing to and helping address climate change. And sort of looking through all the claims and counterclaims, it seemed to be clear that there were 3 sets of arguments that were going on. One was the argument that grazing animals can sequester enough carbon through their grazing and trampling actions such that this will overcompensate for all the methane, nitrous oxide, and other emissions that they produce. So that was the first claim. The second claim was that methane is not important as a greenhouse gas. And the third which was around land use change, and the kind of that was then and this is now argument that while in the past perhaps grazing animals may have been drivers of land use change, now the finger should be pointed at cropping systems. So we try to look at these claims, and before kind of going any further, I think it's really, really important to point out that the word grazing systems simply doesn't do justice to the huge, huge diversity of systems that are kind of encompassed in that term, from the kind of the pastoralism that you see in sub-Saharan Africa through to enormous great ranches, which you finish off with feedlots right at the end of it. So it's really, really difficult to get a handle on what a grazing system actually is, as well as the massive, massive diversity in lands that could be defined as grazing lands, from, the steppes of Mongolia through to the United States, through to some tiny little Welsh upland in the United Kingdom. So it's really, really difficult to generalize. But the conclusions that we came to when it comes to the sequestration issue was that that while in certain systems, grazing animals can sequester carbon, often when soils are initially degraded, where you're improving the situation, the picture's really, really mixed. Some of the staggering claims about reversing climate change are completely overstated. Not overstated, just wrong. And that on the whole, the role of grazing in sequestering carbon is modest at best and does not overcompensate for the direct emissions they cause. When it comes to the methane issue, I think we acknowledge that there is a difference between fossil fuel methane and biological methane, but that so long as there are growing numbers of ruminant livestock, so the warming effects of methane are an issue and will continue to be an issue unless you remove those livestock from the land altogether. As to the kind of historical baseline, the idea that there were lots of wild herbivores in the past, and if only if we got rid of them, they're simply, grazing animals are simply replacing the wild animals. I think you know better than anyone else that the biodiversity value of one or maybe three species, cattle, goats, and sheep, as compared to the kind of huge diversity of herbivores that we have made extinct or that we have kicked off the land, they simply do not compare. And then finally, when it comes to the drivers of land use changes, are really, really complex. And I think the point I would make is that our current food system is really, really unsustainable. And there is a complex interaction between grazing systems, feed production for pig and poultry systems, and cropping for direct human consumption. And that these are kind of very, very collective problems. And I think the final point I would make is that the cow has become used both by advocates of the whole grass-fed movement and indeed advocates of veganism to make the claim that if only we got food right, we would be addressing our environmental problems. So from the sort of grass-fed side, it's like, if I eat meat, so long as it's regenerative, I can carry on driving my car, I don't need to do anything else, I'm doing my bit. And from the vegan perspective, it's if I eliminate animals from my diets, I can carry on flying on holiday and do anything I like. It's wrong. Food is a contributor to the problem of climate change, but all other aspects of our lives are equally important, and that we need to be addressing our lifestyles across the board. Thanks.
Thank you for that great holistic perspective. And I want to kind of take each of your points and break them down. Let's start with Nicholas. Despite the limitations Tara described, there's a lot of excitement about carbon sequestration and ideas about how to regenerate the soil. And can you talk a little bit about this? Are these new innovations, and what are the limits to these models about soil and carbon?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. And I'm going to be echoing some of the statements Tara made. Yeah, let me just first acknowledge that absolutely this is a very complicated topic. Looking at the various grazing models and methods, it's on a spectrum in terms of carbon storage and soil quality and so on. In many cases, land does indeed benefit from a switch to cattle grazing from intensive worst forms of growing crops. Also to acknowledge that many of the worst forms of growing crops are specifically for confined animals. So, I think there's this simple idea of this false dichotomy of comparing one to the other, maybe the best form of grazing to the worst form of growing plants. And I think that's a really poor way of looking at it. Converting annual cropland to about anything else sequesters carbon, including perennial orchards, native tree plantation, meadows. These are all improvements, and growing plants in general has a wide spectrum in terms of impacts as well. But ultimately, growing plants can produce far more protein and calories per acre and free up land as well. So looking specifically at pasture land, there's a limit, possibly a full plateau, but at least like a leveling off of how much carbon can be sequestered in soil. This plateau really differs. It probably depends mostly on how degraded the land was in the first place. It can be anywhere from about 5 years where it kind of starts leveling off, but it could also be several decades. I think important part of all this is that no method of grazing is likely to improve soils that are already in good condition, like native forest and other natural ecosystems that are constantly displaced by cattle grazing. And I think also important with this is, carbon sinks are reversible, and with cattle grazing in particular, carbon storage can be undone quite easily. This can be either from rancher error, lack of resources, or an understanding, but it can be increasingly common impacts of climate change that reverse some of these impacts, like drought and storms. So to me, all this kind of makes it clear that we need to stop deforestation. We need to even probably put a ban on converting key native ecosystems like wild grasslands that are doing well on their own. With carbon drawdown, it's been shown in studies, generally speaking, that agriculture as a whole stores 25 to 75% less soil organic carbon than natural wild ecosystems. That figure varies, obviously. That's from soil scientists Ratin and Lal, but I think this is an important acknowledgement. So what reduces agricultural land? It's not grazing systems. It's not shifting to grass-fed beef. That's going to increase agricultural land in many ways. So, I mean, some of the things that like I mentioned on this, I've learned from the Grazing Confused report and from Tara and many other people doing great work in this space. And one thing mentioned that that report, Grazing Confused, was in the most optimistic conditions, using the most generous of assumptions, grazing cattle could offset only about 20 to 60% of their emissions. So methane is typically not factored into a lot of the conversations of regenerative agriculture and storing carbon, and it doesn't make sense. It needs to be. And then on the other end, like looking at solutions, the opportunity cost of land is increasingly, documented in new studies. The loss of forest, for example, looking at maybe rich countries like the US, we need to look back at like the historical forms of deforestation as well. Because if we look at the loss of forest and natural vegetation dating back to the agricultural revolution, it's a scale of 1,400 billion tons of CO2 that has been released through this deforestation, which is about 40 years of current fossil fuel emissions. And I'm really just stating that for scale, just to understand. And if we instead find ways, which is very difficult, but find ways to shift instead to more plant-based diets in different ways, certainly in rich countries first, we could instead sequester through these natural wild ecosystems equivalent to 9 to 16 years of fossil fuel CO2 emissions. And that figures from a study from Matthew Hayek. And, I think just a couple last points here. I think I'll just sum up that like how these numbers are kind of manipulated and creates deception and confusion is the way the greenhouse gas accounting is done. Oftentimes on even the best forms of pasture land, there is a lot of inputs from off location, whether that is feed to some of the animals, maybe some of the monogastrics on the farm, whether that is manure brought from off farm or even biochar. This is essentially moving carbon from one place to another, and it's not an accurate documentation. And you shouldn't necessarily apply a lot of that to the cattle in itself, because many of these regenerative farms that are storing more carbon also do many other things that are, great conservation agriculture, applying compost, cover crops, and so on. So yeah, just to answer the last part of the question, kind of like where are these coming from? And are these solutions like new innovations? Like I think some of the best agricultural practices can be traced back to many indigenous cultures. So like I first want to acknowledge that. I think that's very clear. But what's largely happening with the increasing trending of the wild claims like Tara mentioned that grazing can reverse climate change or can reverse desertification. This is largely comments appropriated for corporate gain. There's large investments into grass finished systems from some of the biggest agricultural companies in the world, JBS, Cargill, Tyson, but even General Mills, PepsiCo, many fast food chains. And how that works is, they're incentivizing this form of farming. They're marketing it as eco-friendly. And it's going against the scientific consensus that as a form of food, beef is among the worst. So I think we need to look at ways beyond that instead of pretending like we can do things slightly better and it being a better option overall.
Thank you so much. There's so much there. The both of you talked about so much that I want to respond to, and I appreciate you acknowledging the indigenous roots that are being co-opted here by agribusiness. And our third webinar in this series is going to go deeper into that and talk about what regenerative agriculture really attempts to do and what it means and where it comes from, and where its indigenous and Afro-Indigenous roots are, and other, of systems of producing food that might be more sustainable and what that would look like. From food sovereignty and food justice movements. Now, you mentioned a lot there about soil carbon and efforts to sequester carbon, and a lot of this is region specific, which I think we should be more upfront about. That it depends on where cows are and the stocking rates and that kind of thing. But Chris, I want to ask you the next question, which is to follow up on this piece where people who are excited about the potential for grass-fed beef to have improvements on the environment often leave out, I find, the sort of metric for biodiversity, what that means, nature, wildlife, systems. And as an ecologist, I want to ask you this question to talk about more specifically, a cow is a cow. It doesn't matter where they're grazing and how they're managed and stuff, but people leave out the part of regenerative agriculture. One of its tenets is that it promotes biodiversity, right? And so we're sort of skipping over that when we get into the nitty-gritty of just carbon, just methane, although that's very important as well. So I wonder if you could talk about your experience on the ground, how they're glossing over biodiversity, how the picture is a bit deeper, how biodiversity is treated in this conversation, and what's the impact of grazing on biodiversity, on wildlife and nature.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer, this is great to hear about the carbon sequestration and the methane, because when I deal with grazing entirely, how it relates to endangered species and endangered habitats. So growing beef cattle is the top commercial use of public lands in the US. It affects nearly 230 million acres of public land, and it is a known paramount stressor to rare natural resources. In the Southwest, for example, where I work, mostly in Arizona and New Mexico, grazing is implicated in numerous species declines, and it's recognized by the US Fish and Wildlife Service as an ongoing and central threat to many imperiled species. In fact, there's more publications in the literature that discuss grazing as a threat to Western riparian ecosystems than any other single threat, and that includes climate change. Having conducted extensive field surveys throughout Arizona and New Mexico, I can tell you that cattle damage to ecosystems is shockingly severe and pervasive, and that protections given to imperiled species and imperiled habitats are completely inadequate. My jurisdiction with the center is to address livestock grazing in riparian areas. So these are narrow ribbons of lush green vegetation that weave their way through the arid desert. They represent about 1% of the land space, but provide habitat for 80% of Western wildlife and plant species. And the vast majority are in a highly degraded condition directly due to livestock. I'll give you a case study. I work with a lot of endangered fish species, amphibians, reptiles, birds. As you can imagine, any species whose life history is tied to riparian areas in the desert, almost all of them are in decline or are threatened because of habitat degradation. One example, the cottonwood willow riparian forest is something I'm working hard to protect. It's actually the rarest forest type now in North America. And what we have about 1% left of what we originally had. And grazing is still allowed in these ecosystems. And it's been known for decades that cattle actually preclude the cottonwood willow forest regeneration, because quite simply, they eat the seedlings and the saplings. And over decades, what you have is, and this is what we see out there when we conduct our surveys, you have a lot of old mature trees and then nothing else. There's nothing, no young trees to replace the forest. So basically, yeah, these are keystone ecosystems. They're incredibly rare, and cattle are degrading them on an ongoing basis. Climate change alone is a huge hurdle for us right now. But climate change times cattle grazing is a death sentence.
Thank you. And I kind of want to just follow up on that too, about the ways that these areas are sort of degraded. One of the things that I see in the discussions of all this is, let's just put cows in pasture. It's arguably more humane than the factory farm model. Of course, I think we should just set out, just for clarity for people who are kind of less in the know, that all cows are grazed to begin with, right? So what we're talking about is grass finished models as opposed to feedlot models. And of course, a step up from this, regenerative practices aim to do a bit more than just grass fed. But in terms of pasture based, like what is pasture based in terms of biodiversity? It seems to be a sense that, we sort of downplay the supplemental feed that's required for pasture, and act as if grass, putting cows on the grass, innately or inherently is a promotion of biodiversity. That, for example, that putting a cow out to pasture would attract more birds. And it turns out those are cowbirds, which is an invasive species like cattle are. And so that's not creating biodiversity. And I'm wondering, what are the steps, are there examples of pasture-based models? This is a question for everyone, that have done a good job of defining pasture and biodiversity, really taking into account the full picture of water use, of manure pollution. And if not, what do you think the steps are that beef producers who really want to embrace the values of regenerative agriculture would take? And I know that there's probably people listening to this right now and they have a lot of things to say. So please do join us later on the community forum. But just the idea of what does it mean to protect and promote biodiversity? And is pasture-based enough? Any thoughts on that?
I'll just say real quickly that I work in ecosystems that did not evolve with large grazers. And so just from a purely ecological standpoint, there's no room for an animal like this in southeastern Arizona, for example. We see cows in national forests, national monuments, national conservation areas. Really nowhere is safe. Out on the landscape, what they're doing is they're denuding wetlands of vegetation that is needed for imperiled wildlife. They're trampling waterways, polluting them with feces, causing irreversible changes in stream hydrology and plant communities and watershed function, and often results in the wholesale degradation and elimination of rare ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but I mean, I think the biodiversity topic of pasture lands, it's it's becoming a talking point for saying how we increase biodiversity with regenerative ranching. But like you said, Jennifer, it's only certain species of animals we're increasing. Maybe it's a few more birds, but they're invasive. Perhaps there's some more biodiversity in the soil, and that can be good to some extent. But largely, the biodiversity crisis is hundreds of species of mammals and larger animals that we're displacing. And yeah, as Chris mentioned, it's there's many areas where cattle are invasive, most areas. So we should be looking to replace the native animals that were there before ranching.
If I could add a few more comments coming at it from a slightly different angle, and I speak as somebody who is not a biodiversity specialist. I also speak as somebody coming from a very small, very densely populated island. And I think we have quite a different perspective in Europe, where we have a lot of people relative to the land mass available. And I think that the view from your end is different, because you have quite a lot of land. So I think when we think about global trends in animal product consumption, we have to think about how we are going to nourish people effectively. And I think that there are grazing systems that are certainly better than the very, very intensive and inhumane industrialized livestock systems that we see today. But to make the leap from assuming that we can carry on eating as much meat as we seem to want to eat, but just do it in a regenerative or in a grass-fed way, that would be catastrophic, because we would need to clear even more land in order to kind of service our demands. So I think one is left with the conclusion that, if we want systems that are going to be better for livestock, better for welfare, and deliver perhaps some advantages over those feedlot systems, then we are going to have to substantially cut back on our intakes of meat and dairy. And this is where I also get to the point that it gets incredibly bitter and polarized, because as soon as somebody starts to say you need to cut back, people jump into the camp of saying, you're telling me I can never ever eat meat ever again. And that's not really certainly it's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to be, in order to expand the option space for systems that are perhaps more humane, we need to do our bit and cut back on intakes. I think that's a kind of really, really important point. I think the other point to make is that, and again, you will know this better than I do, that there is almost no such thing as a totally wild landscape. We have been, one way or another, modifying the atmosphere almost as long as we have been around. But some landscapes are perhaps more overtly culturally constructed than others. And this comes back to the kind of European, British landscapes that have quite a long cultural history. And these are really, really important to people, and livestock have shaped them over time. So this is perhaps where it also gets very, very kind of bitter and contested, because people are attached to what they know and love, and the animals and the wildlife that they see and know and love. So I think we need to be having some really, really hard conversations about what sort of landscapes will work best in an era of climate change and the protection of those very, very fragile endemic species that do not do very well under kind of livestock cultivation. And we're going to have to kind of adopt perhaps more of a patchwork approach. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I should have said at the outset that I'm coming from, sort of rural Northern California. Tara is coming from England. Nicholas is coming from, I think, Northeast Canada. And Chris is from the Southwest United States. And so all of these regions and landscapes and politics are very, very different and present different opportunities in terms of food and agriculture. I'm in a severe drought right now, for example, and we're going to be hurting in terms of how we produce water intensive beef and dairy. They're going to take a big hit, and we have to think about what the futures look like. And you can see my wolves there on the screen. In terms of biodiversity, I know some grazers are probably watching and screaming, I care about wolves and we use non-lethal methods and so forth, but it goes deeper than that. And I think this part of missing the conversation is what does biodiversity mean? What do intact ecosystems mean? What does it mean, Tara, as you said, is if our landscapes are more wild, less wild, no landscape has been without human interaction, for example. So what do we do moving forward? And how do we move biodiversity and nature into that conversation? I think is a really important piece that I hope we can revisit. And that leads me to my next question is in terms of trade-offs. When we look at the models, for example, of feedlot or factory farmed or CAFO beef versus grass-fed or regenerative or silvopasture, other models, what are the trade-offs between them? Because Nicholas, for example, as you mentioned, a lot of times we downplay or use creative accounting for methane, or we say, well, this model is more humane, or this model has more efficiency. And so, how do you see the trade-offs in this conversation, and how we balance what a sustainable food system and agricultural system would look like? Hopefully, biodiversity is part of that, because often biodiversity is the trade-off. Like now we have this grazing model; it's more whatever the argument is for regenerative, right? It sequesters carbon. And the trade-off is what? That we employ wildlife services to slaughter wolves or to dump pesticides on the grass to eliminate grasshoppers so that cattle can graze the grass. How do you see some of the trade-offs and how do you resolve them? It's sort of a broad question, but just your interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, the FAO has largely been calling for intensification dating back to the early 2000s, and this has been an environmental call for why they've done that. Of course, they haven't factored in some other things like animal welfare. They haven't factored in all kinds of other host of environmental issues that intensification, largely factory farms, will bring. But high level, shifting more to grass-finished cattle will emit more methane. This is because animals will live longer. It takes them longer to get to slaughter weight. And they're eating typically a more fibrous diet. So, there's been estimates that they emit 3 to 4 times more methane than a cow that's more on feedlot. So I think that's important right there. And of course, just using more land. This might depend on where you are in the world, but high level grass-finished cattle use far more land. So in many ways, that is worse than intensification. But I mean, in terms of like fattening up cattle quickly in factory feedlots, this takes a whole lot of feed, which also causes a whole lot of deforestation. And a lot of the feed comes from areas that are very biodiverse rich as well. So, I don't like these two options. That's why I've opted for the other option, which is shifting to plant-based and getting as far away of those two as I can, because I don't see either of those as a realistic solution. Obviously, that's difficult. Obviously, that's more complicated than how I just kind of laid it out. But we've largely offered those two options to continue feeding people beef, and I don't support that. So I think taking a more practical, realistic approach and saying, what is the goal? Are we looking specifically at methane and carbon? Are we looking at land use? Are we looking at biodiversity? And I think factoring all of those, neither of those two options are good. And we just need to figure out what the best way of shifting away from both of those would be.
But perhaps can I add just one or two things. I mean, I think we're also speaking, we're all coming from a very northern affluent country perspective, and I think the issues are very different in different parts of the world. And I think this is also where kind of subtlety and nuance is needed, that the solution is not the same wherever you are, and issues of affordability are also factors. I think there's a lot of concern. Again, it's this binary thinking. I think there's a lot of concern that if you critique or question some of the sequestration claims made about grass-fed, then suddenly you are automatically saying that feedlot production is the way forward. And I would very much reject that as a false binary, as Nicholas has just said. But I think there are also issues of affordability and equity. And I mean, we have this phrase in the UK, which probably resonates with you, which is the idea of less and better meat consumption. So we cut back, and we also consume meat that has advantages in other way, perhaps for welfare or for the, remunerating farmers properly and all the rest of it. But that is also something that not everyone can afford. And that's where you need changes in the balance of incentives and disincentives. This is where you need good governance and pretty much measures that completely change the incentives that are given to produce in particular ways at particular costs. And of course, many of the solutions will also come from outside the food system, which is to do with, better jobs, better working conditions, better employments, better incomes for people, so that they can afford less and better foods of all kinds, with meat a far less central place in the diet than it is in the affluent West today.
Thank you. So many great points there. And yes, and for us, this massive subsidy shift might be part of that, so that people could afford a healthy, sustainable diet, and also that producers could afford to produce food in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And there's a lot of greenwashing, though. And so I kind of want to ask, before I turn to audience questions, how do we correct this myth? I know we're working on that now, but how do we bring this back down to scale? How can we have this conversation? I mean, a lot of this, people should be on the same page. In a smaller rate with less consumption, some of these practices would be more realistic. But how do we get away from this silver bullet kind of framing where, even beyond beef, but just for example, for beef, a cow is the silver bullet to the climate crisis, for example, or a cow is the solution to the biodiversity crisis, the extinction crisis. This is kind of mirrored in films like Kiss the Ground, where, people learn what I do. I run into them on the street and they ask me, have they seen this film? It's really pervasive. And yet, it makes a lot of good points, and it has some mythology as well. So how can we present a more balanced view in our conversations that get away from this dialectic and the binary tariff, for example? Just questions for all of you. So we can just have more realistic, practical conversations about this with your average person. Any thoughts on how you all do that?
Well, go ahead, Chris, or does anyone want to butt in?
I just wanted to say quickly, throughout the 11 Western states, only less than 2% of the US beef supply comes from these public lands cattle. And just with that tiny little amount of the industry, we're seeing, 85% of our public lands are in a degraded state. So really reduction is the only way forward. There's no room in our natural ecosystems to shift the industry that way. It's already such a tiny slice of the pie, but the damage is catastrophic.
Yeah, I would just echo that point too. I mean, the reduction message needs to be in there. That would be telling the truth. If we have to look at a more balanced approach to this, it's first acknowledging that. So I totally welcome, of course, improvements and ways for ranchers to adapt. There's many things that can be done to improve the land, to avoid overgrazing, to minimize biodiversity loss. That one's a bit trickier, but there's certainly many things that can be done. But this can't be within a scheme of this is going to be the new way to feed the world. And we need to keep in mind that these solutions, like we need to be able to feed the 10 billion people that we'll have by 2050. So totally open and welcome to different solutions, but they need to be scalable. And, you know, I just think like a more balanced story would be meeting people where they are, of course. We're not just going to be completely shifting away from this anytime soon. So I think there's many science-based conservation incentives that we can implement with landowners that don't plan on shifting how they use the land anytime soon. So I think incentives can play a role, but as long as we continue subsidizing and incentivizing beef of all forms, then we're going to continue to not factor in the real price of meat on the environment. And that needs to change.
And I think I would just ask the question, regenerative for what? I think, you know, as I just go about my life, I see regenerative applied to parenting, to education, to cities. You could be, you know, a regenerative parent now. So it's a buzzword that has kind of caught on. And if you substitute it with another word like abracadabra, for example, or open sesame, it has the same sort of magic effect. And I think we have to be really, really clear about what words mean and what attributes we associate with it. At the moment, that is not the case with regenerative. It has a general positive kind of feel-good set of associations, but it, as I think perhaps you pointed out right at the beginning, it's been everyone wants a slice of the regenerative pie now. If you're a big corporation to a tiny little farmer, and it means vastly different things to different people. So we have to be very, very clear about what the word is, the extent to which it is just the latest snake oil, and the extent to which there are some perhaps really good agricultural practices in there that are worth exploring, investigating, and experimenting with further. So I think we are, you know, we're kind of in the Wild West really when it comes to the term, and we need to be more cautious without being closed-minded.
Thank you. I think that's a really great way to put that. And that nuance always needs to be returned to the conversation. And one of the things I want to clear up, I'm looking at one of the audience questions now. A common argument from animal agriculturists is that the land used for cattle grazing cannot be used for anything else. And since it's used for food production, is the best use for the land. How would you respond to this? And this is a question, I think, essentially about marginal lands. You know, are cows a good solution for what we would consider, or what some would consider marginal lands?
I mean, marginal to who, right? Like, I think that's the main part here. Not to many native animals that still were displaced in this area. Certainly there is some form of land that is less biodiverse and could benefit from other uses, but to justify ranching because some land is degraded, one, that could degrade it further. Two, there's many other ecosystem benefits to even slightly degraded land. There's also ways to rewild with a bit more of a hands-on approach that can help restore that land. And there was a study actually recently out of New Zealand that looked at marginal agricultural lands, and 77 to 100% of marginal agricultural lands financially benefited from afforestation as part of a carbon credit system. So obviously that's not the case everywhere, but I think that these are important things to consider, not just the specific human-centric use of that land, because we can feed the world if we shift towards plant-based. We largely can. We can feed the upcoming population. So this is what we need to keep in mind as a frame, that we don't need to use all land.
And I think I would also add that, you know, Nicholas's points were all excellent points, that that other space for other animals is really, really important. There will be some instances where, for cultural, livelihood reasons, whatever, it may make sense to keep animals on the land. But just go back to the point that the argument for animals as a kind of ecological aid is going to yield very, very little meat. So if that is the role of animals, to aid in the restoration or maintenance of certain ecosystems, and there have been some quite, you know, interesting experimentation in the UK to that effect, the amount of meat you're going to get out of it is going to be very, very little. It's a byproduct of their role within the ecosystem. And so you go back to the idea that we need to be cutting back on the amount of meat we eat, and the idea that, you know, there's kind of no such thing as a free steak, as it were.
Just trying to unmute myself there. Okay, it's just combining a couple questions, and this is a very common question, so I think we can answer it quickly. But in the United States, there's this sense that we exterminated the bison as part of exterminating indigenous peoples. And so these areas need to be grazed, and they'll be degraded. Grasslands will be degraded if they aren't grazed by cattle. You have a response by that?
Yeah, you know, that was one of the biggest mistakes our culture ever made, is eliminating all the bison and replacing it with cattle. There are some ecosystems that did evolve with large grazers like bison, and the grass should be grazed, but cattle, in some cases, they can approximate bison, but they are not bison ecologically. And again, there's many places here in the West that there never were bison. There never were large grazers. So it's, you know, the savory method as it's used here in southeastern Arizona, it really has no bearing. You know, this is an ecosystem, again, that did not evolve with these animals.
Just quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think a question I do see very often, and an email I've gotten from our supporters also is, hey, have you heard of Alan Savory and the Savory Institute? What do you think of that? And I'm wondering if you have any input to respond to that question about the savory method of grazing.
I'd happily respond. I mean, I've done full podcasts on this. I try to be as open-minded as possible, and I read so much stuff that is against the positions that I take, and I want to learn more. In this case, I don't think this is necessarily something that's quality scientific evidence. It's in fact been debunked in many scientific literatures across the spectrum. Just recently, in terms of biodiversity, there was a study out of the University of Alberta that was a meta-analysis of the effects of removing cattle from land, and across all animals, livestock exclusion increased abundance and biodiversity. And there was a particular part of that study that looked at areas of land that were extremes, like in low precipitation deserts. And of course, savory, the big thing is reversing desertification through cattle grazing. And there's very little evidence to support that as a quality solution. And in fact, that will be very damaging to many ecosystems. It'll reduce already limited plant biomass in these areas, and largely decrease whatever's left to in animal diversity. So yeah, a lot can be said about that. I mean, he's also acknowledged that the scientific method doesn't have a whole lot of value in this. I just think this is kind of taking a life of its own. And a lot of the farms that he also supports as like one's like a #1 Savory Institute farm, which would be White Oak Pastures in Georgia in the States. And in this case, of course, they've done some things that are better. They've applied compost to their land, cover crops, I've done a lot of things that were better, but just on the peripheral of their land, there's also a lot of forests which were displaced. And instead they'll talk about how much they've improved the land from intensive, I think it was cotton farming before. So yes, you've improved it a bit, but there's also many other uses of that land. And that's a perfect example right there of some very poor greenhouse gas accounting that was happening because it wasn't they don't factor in the feed crops that are brought from off land, which largely could have been intensive feed crops. And then that brings carbon into the land because those animals then produce manure and add carbon to the land in that case. So yeah, I just don't think it's, I think it's kind of taken a life of its own and it isn't supported by much scientific evidence.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. We're getting hundreds and hundreds of questions here. Some very interesting and productive. One of the questions I think is for Chris. Let's go. Just to talk a little bit more specifically, if you can give examples of the ways that riparian areas are damaged, because some people are chiming in about this area and that area, and if we don't do cattle ranching in these areas, it'll be converted to vineyards or to condominiums, which is a common argument as well. And it's got to be this binary again, this one or the other, and that cattle ranching can be an opportunity for environmental progress in some of these areas, although again, leaving out the drought and the emissions and so forth. Chris, can you just give an example about impact on riparian areas? I think they want a little bit more details about the impacts there.
Yeah, and first of all, I work in public lands, so national forests. There's not going to be if we can remove grazing from a national forest, there's not going to be a strip mall that goes up the next year. So what cattle do in these systems? First and foremost, they are denuding the vegetation, and they're actually exposing the ground. So what used to be a wet, cool, shaded environment is now open and receiving full sunlight. This causes the water, and it's very little water to begin with, to evaporate faster. The second mechanism is they're trampling stream banks, causing erosion. They're causing the stream to widen and become more shallow. So this is removing breeding habitat for fish, and it's also, again, causing higher rates of evaporation of water. And like I mentioned earlier, they are, by consuming the seedlings and saplings of riparian obligate trees, they are preventing the forest from regenerating itself. So as the older, larger canopy trees die, again, this is opening the system up to sunlight and evaporation, and it reaches a tipping point where the stream will simply dry up. And that's especially true with our record-breaking, it seems like every year we're breaking a heat or a drought record out here. This water is disappearing in real time, even without the cow impacts. So to suggest that cows can mitigate climate change, at least out here in the American West, is completely false.
Thank you so much. And I think, as you've all sort of presented, the idea that cows can mitigate biodiversity, climate change, any of these environmental impacts as a silver bullet solution, or even to the food justice issue, is a bit overstated. And we need to step back a little bit from silver bullet binary frameworks and talk about specific instances, region-based, country-based, and so forth, and smaller scale. And we're going to continue the series talking about this in terms of culture and what people are bringing to these conversations. And there's hundreds of questions that the audience have asked that we're not going to be able to get to. So I want to be able to pull back more. We're going to put some links in the chat now from my special helper at the center here. I want to thank all of you for joining us. For our panelists, Tara Garnett, Nicholas Carter and Chris Budby, we have a brand new website that we're launching today called grazingfacts.com. I hope that you all rush over to go check it out. You can sign up for our next grazing webinar, which will be April 7th. It's going to continue the conversation about climate and culture wars and policy solutions. And that series will be posted as well on takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. You can sign up for a newsletter that I write through the center called Food X. You could read past issues and we'll be continuing to discuss this. And of course, you can email me with your questions, as I get many emails about this topic and other food related issues. You can learn more about Tara Garnett's work at Table Debates, and you can transfer your questions and continue this conversation at the community forum that they've put up there, which is really wonderful. It's a good opportunity to learn a lot more, to continue this discussion, to have your questions heard and answered. I appreciate Tara. Thank you very much for sharing that platform with us. That's at community.tabledebates.org. You can learn more about Nicholas Carter's work at plantbaseddata.org and follow him on Twitter. Things get feisty over there, but he's got great, intelligent, rational threads of resources and research as well. Biologicaldiversity.org. You can track Chris Budby's work, his ecological work. There was a question in the chat about whether he's working on some of the lawsuits to protect the riparian areas in the Southwest, and he most certainly is, and he does fascinating work. So you can check out that on our website as well. And finally, I can't tell you how many questions I got about this. The webinar will be recorded. It's going to be posted on our YouTube channel, on our websites and social media. You can follow me at Jennifer Molidor on Twitter. We have some good feisty conversations over there as well. But ultimately, I don't want the feistiness. I want the discussion. I want a rational grounding, bringing it back to earth. So I'm hoping that that's what we continue as well. I think our panelists presented pretty fair-minded views as well research views, and I hope that you will follow their work and continue to support them and engage with them and continue the discussion as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you next time on April 7th. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.